My best friend said. This is dangerous. I laughed, but not entirely because it was funny. I laughed because I didn't know how else to respond. So is loving you, I wanted to say, but I didn't. Not yet. It was Tuesday, a little after 3, and the repair shop smelled like oil and wet concrete, the kind of smell that sticks to your hands no matter how many times you wash. I was under the hood of an old pickup, sleeves rolled up, muscles tense from holding the jack in place. That's when she appeared in the doorway. Her name was Marianne. Mid-40s, sharp-edged, every inch of her self-assurance baked into the way she walked, the tilt of her chin, the faint smirk that hovered even when she wasn't smiling. Her hair caught the light just so, like she'd stepped out of a magazine cover I'd never seen but somehow recognized. She carried a small stack of paperwork, her perfume faint but lingering, a mix of jasmine and something warmer I couldn't place. She didn't notice me at first. I watched her as she moved toward the counter, the heels of her boots tapping lightly, a rhythm that made the space feel smaller, tighter, charged. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. There was a kind of gravity in the way she occupied the room, and I, stubbornly, wanted to be drawn into it. When she finally looked at me, her eyes flicked over the grease on my hands, the smudge on my cheek, and for a heartbeat, her gaze softened. Not pity, not judgment, something like curiosity, like she was measuring a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. I cleared my throat, wiped my hands on a rag, trying not to pretend I wasn't aware of the small, electric weight between us. I think this is the last form, she said, voice calm, deliberate. She set the papers down and hesitated, one hand brushing against the edge of the counter, as if she wasn't certain she wanted to leave or stay. I nodded, words stuck somewhere behind my teeth. So I just said, thanks. Not for the form, for standing there, for letting me notice her without pretending it was normal. She smiled then, a brief, almost guilty curve of her lips, and it made my chest tighten. There was a pause, the kind that stretches and suddenly becomes something dangerous, something unspoken. I wanted to ask her something, anything, but the moment slipped away before I could catch it. Instead, she turned, and the papers rustled in her hand, a quiet sound that lingered longer than it should have. And just before she left, she paused at the door. Not looking back, not smiling, just a tilt of her head, a silent acknowledgement. I stayed there, under the hood of the truck, heart hammering in a rhythm I couldn't name. The smell of oil, the faint warmth of sunlight through the garage windows, the memory of her gaze, it all pressed against my skin in a way that wouldn't let go. By the time I finally finished with the truck, the moment was gone. But her presence wasn't. And I realized I hadn't just been looking at her. I'd been trying to memorize her. The way she moved, the sound of her voice, the way the air seemed heavier where she'd been. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. It was Thursday afternoon, quieter than usual in the shop. Most of the clients had schedules that didn't match mine, and the fluorescent lights hummed low, filling the empty spaces with a sort of sterile calm. Marianne appeared again, this time leaning slightly on the counter, arms crossed, a notebook tucked under one elbow. She looked tired, just a little. Enough for me to notice the faint shadow beneath her eyes and the way her fingers drummed lightly on the cover, restless. "Hey," I said, setting down a wrench. My voice sounded too loud in the silence. She glanced at me, just a flicker of acknowledgement, and then turned back to her papers. She always kept her distance like a moat around something valuable, something private, and part of me wanted to cross it without asking permission. "Could you check the engine light in the van outside?" she asked finally. The words were casual, but there was a tremor I caught, subtle, almost apologetic, as if she didn't want to admit she needed help. I nodded and followed her outside, the sun falling at a slant that made everything shimmer faintly. While I crouched beside the hood, she leaned over the edge, arms brushing against mine, close enough that I could feel the warmth through my sleeves. She didn't speak much, just watching, occasionally biting her lip when I adjusted a cable or tapped a sensor. Her quiet made my own voice heavier than I expected, every explanation more careful, more aware of how she might perceive me. At one point, I glanced at her hands, slender, with faint lines from work, maybe stress, or age, or life itself. She moved them as if to fidget with the notebook, but hesitated, letting them hover, poised and restrained. I noticed the little things, the slight curl of her fingers, the soft inhale she made when something didn't seem right under the hood, even the faint laugh she tried to suppress when a bird landed too close. She was careful with herself, and yet she let little cracks show, just enough for me to see. "I think that should fix it," I said softly, stepping back. She didn't move at first, just leaned against the van, folding her arms again. Then she nodded once, barely, and whispered a quiet, "Thanks," so low I almost missed it. We stood there for a moment longer, a space stretched between us, neither of us quite knowing what to say. I wanted to tell her how much I noticed, how the way she shifted her weight, how she tucked strands of hair behind her ear, how she looked exhausted yet still precise. It made my chest tighten. But I didn't. I just lingered, the quiet hum of the engine beneath our feet. Then she straightened, the moment dissolving as she lifted her notebook and turned toward the door. I caught her hand brushing briefly against mine. Not enough to be accidental, not enough to be obvious, but enough to make my heart jolt. Her eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, guarded but soft, and I wanted to reach for that, to hold on to it, to understand what she wouldn't say. By the time she stepped back inside, I was left crouched beside the van, staring at the hood like it had suddenly become the only thing separating us from something I couldn't name but already felt pulling at me. That brush of her fingers lingered in my mind, small, fleeting, but charged. And just like that, I realized I was already waiting for the next time. That night, the shop was closed, and rain drummed steadily against the windows. Only a single overhead light hummed, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Marianne was there, checking inventory, papers spread across the counter in disarray. I was organizing tools nearby, pretending that the hammer I held required all my attention, but really I couldn't stop noticing her. She leaned forward to read a label, and our elbows brushed. Just a flick, barely there, but my chest jumped anyway. She didn't comment, didn't pull away, just adjusted slightly, and for a moment, our shoulders were close enough to feel the warmth through our jackets. "I didn't expect anyone else to be here," she said softly. I turned toward her, words caught in my throat, unsure if I should ask why she stayed late or just keep breathing. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her hand lingering, and I saw the faint tremor of fatigue in her fingers. We talked quietly about inventory numbers, car parts, the mundane rhythm of the day, and yet the air between us seemed charged with something unnamed. I wanted to reach for her hand, to let her know that I saw the small cracks in her guard, that I noticed the tired curve of her shoulders, the way her laugh came softly and hesitated at the edges. But I didn't. I could feel the line we weren't supposed to cross pressing against my ribs. Suddenly, her phone buzzed on the counter. I saw the name flash, someone from her past, a reminder of complicated stories she carried with her like shadows. She glanced at it, lips pressing together, eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second before she silenced it. The moment was brief, but it was enough to make the quiet between us feel heavier, as if her life beyond the shop was pressing in on the small bubble we shared. She gave a faint, almost shy smile, glancing up at me with that careful warmth she reserved only for moments she allowed herself to be unguarded. My hands itched to say something, anything that might bridge the distance, but words felt clumsy. I swallowed, adjusted a wrench in my hand, and kept my voice steady. "Looks like we're done for tonight," I said. She nodded, gathering her papers. For a beat, I thought she might say more, reveal a secret, lean in a little closer. Her eyes lingered on mine, searching, hesitant, a question unspoken in their depths. I could almost feel her thoughts brushing against mine, a silent confession poised on the edge. And then, the sound of the door opening broke the spell, an errant car horn outside, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt, and she straightened abruptly, professional, distant again. The tension vanished, leaving only the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the faint scent of rain and oil. I stayed frozen for a moment, heart thumping, staring at her retreating figure. I hadn't touched her, hadn't spoken the words that hung between us, and yet the air felt different, charged. Close enough to taste, close enough to want, but not close enough to cross. I crouched beside the workbench, staring at the scattered papers, thinking about the brush of her elbow, the tremor in her hands, the way her eyes held a question I couldn't answer yet. Almost, but not quite. And somehow, that almost was enough to keep me awake that night. The rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and heavy. The shop smelled of wet concrete and lingering oil, a scent that somehow felt intimate after hours of quiet work. I was crouched by the back bay, checking a part, when I noticed Marianne standing by the window, arms crossed, staring out at the darkened street. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she shifted, brushing a hand along the windowsill, tracing an invisible line. Her shoulders were tight, but her gaze wasn't on me. I don't know," she said finally, voice soft, hesitant. The pause afterward stretched, a gap filled with everything we hadn't said. I straightened, wiping my hands on a rag, not knowing whether to step closer or give her space. She turned then, just enough for her eyes to meet mine. There was a flicker of something, confusion, frustration, maybe even fear, embedded in the curve of her lips. "What are we doing?" she asked. The words weren't accusatory, not exactly, but they landed like stones in a pond, rippling outwards, shaking the balance between us. I wanted to answer. Wanted to say it was nothing, that this was fine, that my chest wasn't tightening every time she looked at me. But none of those things were true. So I said nothing. I just watched her, the way her fingers tapped lightly against her notebook, the subtle tremble in her wrist that I'd never noticed before. She took a step closer, just a small movement, careful, as if testing the air between us. "I can't pretend this isn't strange anymore," she whispered. Her voice was almost lost beneath the hum of the overhead light, but it carried more weight than a shout. I swallowed hard, realizing she'd stripped away the pretense that had kept us both safe. For months, we had danced around the edges, moments of closeness, flickers of attention, but never admitting what those sparks meant. And now, standing there in the dim light, I could feel the weight of all those almost moments pressing down. "I don't know how to handle this," she continued, eyes searching mine, brimming with something fragile and real. Vulnerability, confusion, something that made my chest ache in a way I hadn't anticipated. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The space between us felt smaller, tighter, charged with the honesty neither of us could yet voice. I wanted to reach for her, to say that I felt the same, that I'd been waiting for her to ask, that I didn't know how to resist, but I didn't. My hands stayed at my sides, my mouth dry, heart hammering. Finally, she looked down, as if the answer she needed would somehow be etched in the floor. "I can't stop thinking that maybe we're ruining something," she said, and the words hung there, fragile and trembling. "Or maybe we already have." And with that, she turned away, leaving me crouched there, staring at the back bay, the air thick and heavy, the silence louder than any touch. I wanted to follow her, to reach for her, but I stayed frozen, knowing that sometimes letting someone walk away, even for a moment, is the only way to understand what you're willing to risk. Her absence, however brief, left a hollowness that refused to fade. It was a Saturday morning, and the shop smelled faintly of coffee and wet tires. I was wiping down the counter when Marianne appeared, notebook in hand, moving slower than usual. There was a weight to her that day, a quiet gravity that pressed against the air like a storm waiting to break. "I found something," she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. She set a folded envelope on the counter. I noticed her hands tremble slightly as she did it, fingers brushing the paper like it might bite back. I frowned. "Found where?" "Old files, letters, notes from before," she said, glancing away. Her voice caught briefly, like she wasn't sure she wanted to continue. "From someone I lost. A long time ago." I didn't touch the envelope. I just watched her, noticing the faint crease in her brow, the way her shoulders tensed and then softened, like a breath held too long. "You want to talk about it?" I asked carefully, aware that some things were too heavy for words. She shook her head at first, but then paused, just long enough for a crack to appear in her armor. "It's stupid," she murmured. "I thought I'd moved on, but seeing these letters, it's like a part of me never really left that time behind." Her eyes flicked toward mine for a brief second, searching, as if wondering whether I'd understand. I wanted to say something comforting, something that would make it all okay, but instead, I reached across the counter and lifted the envelope. I traced my finger over the top fold. "You don't have to explain. I see you." She looked at me then, the faintest edge of a smile breaking through, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Seeing me, huh?" she whispered, voice a little rough, almost teasing, but not quite. Her hands hovered near the envelope, hovering but not closing, as if unsure whether to protect it or let it go. I noticed the tiny details, the way her hair fell just off her shoulder, the faint tremble of her fingers, the slow inhale she didn't realize she was holding. I wanted to reach out, to steady her, to say something permanent and true, but the words lodged themselves in my throat. Instead, I just stayed there, the silence stretching, heavy but intimate. And then, quietly, she said something that shifted everything. I forgot what it feels like to be seen without explaining. Her gaze met mine, steady and raw, and in that instant, the distance between us narrowed, not because of a touch, but because of recognition. I felt the ground shift beneath me, not dramatic, not theatrical, just seismic in its quietness. Everything I thought I understood about her, about us, trembled. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just observing anymore. I was part of it, part of whatever this was. She folded the letters carefully, hands lingering a moment longer on the envelope. Then, without another word, she left the counter. I stayed still, staring at the faint crease she had left behind, a line so small, yet enough to mark a change I could feel in my chest. And somehow, that simple pause, her hand, her eyes, the silence between us, shifted everything. It was late evening, the shop bathed in the soft orange glow of a setting sun, dust motes drifting lazily through the light. We were the only ones there, no clients, no noise, just the hum of the overhead fan and the faint scent of motor oil and old paper. Marianne sat on the edge of the counter, notebook closed beside her. I leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, pretending to organize tools, but really listening to the rhythm of her breathing. We didn't speak at first. Words felt unnecessary, even fragile. There was a subtle gravity in the air, a pull neither of us needed to name. Months of tension, of almosts, of shared silences and fleeting glances, had led to this quiet moment of inevitability. She shifted slightly, and our knees brushed. A small, accidental contact, but enough to make my chest tighten. She didn't pull away. I didn't move closer. We simply existed in the same space, aware of each other, aware of the unspoken that had been building for weeks, months. "I didn't expect it to feel like this," she said softly, voice almost lost to the fan. Her fingers curled around the edge of the counter, tracing a faint line absent-mindedly. "Just being here with you. Like this." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I know." The simplicity of the words felt heavier than any grand declaration. We both understood without having to articulate it. The truth had been there all along, woven into our glances, our silences, the brush of her hand against mine when she wasn't thinking about it. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. Not in the way people look in movies or stories, all dramatic and overwhelming, but in a way that felt real, human, earned. Imperfect, careful, and alive. Then, slowly, tentatively, I reached out. My hand brushed hers, just the back of her hand against mine, enough to send a ripple through me. She didn't flinch. Instead, her fingers found mine, lacing together naturally, effortlessly. That tiny connection spoke louder than any confession ever could. We stayed that way, sitting side by side, hands intertwined, the sun's glow fading to dusk. No words, no promises, just the quiet understanding that what had been building between us was no longer avoidable. No grand gestures, no speeches, just this shared space, this fragile, inevitable closeness. Her head tilted slightly, almost resting against my shoulder, though not fully. I didn't move. I didn't have to. The closeness said it all. And as the last light slipped through the windows, I realized that everything we had avoided, every hesitation, every almost moment, had led us here. Not to perfection, not to fantasy, but to something real, something earned. Finally, the shop was quiet, the air still. Hands still intertwined. We sat there without needing to say more. The world outside could wait. It was enough. It's weeks later now, and I'm sitting in the quiet corner of the shop, the familiar smell of oil and sunlight through the windows wrapping around me like an old friend. Mary Ann is at the counter, humming softly as she flips through her notebook. She looks up, our eyes meet, and I feel that same quiet pull I first noticed months ago, the one that started with accidental brushes and hesitant smiles. Things aren't perfect. We've both made mistakes, said the wrong things, and held back when we shouldn't have. But they don't feel heavy anymore. We've learned to exist in the space between certainty and chaos, finding the small, earned moments that speak louder than any grand gesture ever could. I notice the little things, the way she crinkles her nose when she's thinking, the soft tapping of her fingers when she's impatient, the subtle warmth in her gaze when she catches me looking. And I notice myself, more patient, more aware, more willing to lean into uncertainty rather than run from it. Love, I realize, isn't about fireworks or perfect timing. It's about presence, the gentle gravity that pulls you together in spite of everything else. About letting someone occupy the space inside your chest without forcing it into words too soon. About sharing silence and coffee and broken tools and still feeling full. Sometimes we laugh at absurd things. Sometimes we pause because one of us notices a tremor in the other's voice or a shadow beneath the eyes. And sometimes we don't speak at all, just letting the shared space between us carry the weight of what we feel. That quiet understanding, that fragile, earned intimacy, is what makes it real. I've realized that moments we almost had, words we almost said, the hesitation that used to make me ache, they were all shaping this. Every near miss, every silent glance, every careful touch led us here. Not to perfection, not to fantasy, but to something stronger, a love that is deliberate, patient, and human. And as she reaches across the counter to hand me a wrench, our fingers brushing briefly, I don't need to say anything. That small contact says it all. No confessions, no promises, just acknowledgement. Just this. Just us. Sometimes I catch myself smiling, thinking back to the first day she walked into the shop, mid-afternoon sunlight catching her hair, and I realize how far we've come. And I know we'll keep learning, keep stumbling, keep leaning into the quiet pull that started it all. It's not a storybook ending. It's better. It's ours. And if you've ever noticed someone who makes the quiet moments feel alive, who shifts something inside you without a single word, maybe you understand what I mean. Maybe you're waiting for your own inevitable, earned connection. And if you are, tell me in the comments. I want to hear your story. P.